Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Destiny Youth Online Bible Study. I'm here with Iswat.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. All right, we are going through the book of Exodus now. We finished Genesis, so here we are in the second book of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses. So Exodus kind of sets the story of Moses and the rescue of God's people from Egypt. Historically, Moses would have been born sometime around 1525 BC. He spent about 40 years of his life in the courts of Pharaoh. Sometimes we can overlook these ages in the Bible and realize some of the people that God calls, he calls them from a young age, and some he calls at a very old age. Moses was not called until he was 80, which we will discover. But he grows up 40 years of his life in the courts of Pharaoh, possibly Thutmose the first and the second, and then the queen, which is Hatshepsut. Some of these Egyptian names are really difficult. But then, as we get into the story, Moses runs from Egypt when he is the age of 40, spends another 40 years as a shepherd with the Midianites, and then he is called by God to go and rescue the people of Israel. That is what we are going to get through in this section of the podcast, and then we will have questions at the end for you guys as a family or you as friends to discuss with each other. We're looking to end this one possibly around 30 minutes or so. So we will go ahead and get started. Last time, when we left off in Genesis, we had Joseph in Egypt. He brought his whole family over. They lived in Egypt in the land of Goshen. They had this territory given to them, but now years have passed, around 400 or so, and the Hebrews, the Israelites, are now enslaved by the Egyptians. So, Iswat, would you begin reading in chapter 1, verse 8?
Okay. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. Now then arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen, in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. And he said, When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive.
Okay, so in chapter 1, we are seeing what has been happening in Egypt. So it has been over 200 years since the death of Joseph. So the identity of this Pharaoh is not fully certain, but we believe it is Thutmose, which would make a little bit more sense because whenever we see in a moment, the daughter of Pharaoh pulls Moses from the river. He is given the name Moses, Thutmose. So if she is naming Moses after Thutmose, then this makes more sense. So we also see with the line of pharaohs, this is the 18th dynasty, where we have the Thutmose, Amos, Amenhotep, all of these pharaohs coming out of this this dynasty. There's one moment where the queen has to rule, and this is after Moses leaves. When he comes back, there is now a new pharaoh who is the pharaoh of the Exodus. So if this is Thutmose, then the daughter is likely Hatshepsut, who then becomes the queen or the pharaoh after the death of her father. So also want to point out that Moses' name means drawing out in Hebrew, but then in Egyptian, the name means man of royalty, which is why we think that it's Thutmose, because Mos is man of royalty if he's named after this pharaoh. So a couple of other things to point out. Moses is brought up in the royal Egyptian court, so this provides him with this top-notch education. He is known within the courts of the Egyptians. But the interesting thing to point out whenever we get further into the story is the Lord does not allow Moses to fully be comfortable in the court of Pharaoh, because he keeps seeing his people, the Hebrews, in enslavement. And how easy would it have been to have just been comfortable within this court? Because it's like, I'm not having to go and do all of this slave work. I'm getting to learn these different things. I have servants. This is awesome. But the Lord does not allow Moses to fully forget that and be comfortable. So we have the birth of Moses in 2. Of course, the Pharaoh he has decided that all these new baby boys are going to be thrown into the Nile. Why boys? Because men are the ones who go and do the fighting. If we have a whole bunch of Hebrew men getting jacked from all of this bricklaying work, and then they decide one day, hey, let's rise up and kill these Egyptians and take over, then that's very possible. So that he is doing population control. So Moses is born. His mother hides him and then puts him in the basket, of course, and sends his sister Miriam to watch him, make sure that he's safe. So he floats down the Nile. And then in chapter 2, verse 5, now the daughter of Pharaoh, who we believe is all these names, man. Where is it? Hatshepsut. We believe it's her. She goes down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens, and she walked along the riverbank, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maids to get it, and they brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying, and she took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrew children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get a wet nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? So Miriam is smart. She's awesome. She goes up. She's like, oh, hey, cool baby. Listen, do you need a woman to nurse this child? Because I know a lady who's ready to nurse a child. So we actually get to see this beautiful thing where this woman trusts God, places her baby in the basket, floats him down the Nile, and then God makes it to where she gets to nurse her own baby, gets to see him grow, and then live this great life in Pharaoh's court. So and then verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. One day, after Moses had grown into adulthood, it happened that He went to his countrymen and looked with compassion at their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his countrymen. He turned to look around, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So, we already have Moses being a murderer. Not a lot of people like to look at the whole full story of Moses and then remember, oh, wait, this whole thing started with Moses murdering a guy, which, you could argue like his sense of justice, whatever. I argue with that. It's like, does it make the murder right? No. But at the same time, we understand this wasn't like a crime out of selfishness. This was a heated response in anger, which sometimes we see Moses's response with anger. He went out the next day, saw 2 Hebrew men fighting with each other, and he said to the aggressor, "Why are you striking your friend?" But the man said, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Certainly, this incident is known." Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard about this matter, he tried to kill Moses. Then Moses fled from Pharaoh's presence and took refuge in the land of Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now the priests of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water from the well where Moses was resting, and filled the troughs of water of their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. So he goes to Midian, which the Midianites were born of one of the sons of Abraham and Keturah. So after Abraham's wife Sarah dies, he remarries Keturah. So this is another one of the descendants of Abraham in Midian. So he shows up, he helps out these daughters, he meets Jethro, who is the high priest of Midian. He ends up marrying Zipporah, his daughter. She gives birth to a son, and then another son. Now in verse 23, now it happened after a long time, about 40 years, that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel groaned and sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help ascended to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel and took notice of them and was concerned about them, knowing all, understanding all, remembering all. So now we come into chapter 3. This is where we hear the call of Moses from the Lord to go and rescue these people. So, Iswat, would you read chapter 3, verse 2?
Okay. Exodus 3, chapter 3, verse 2. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed.
Stop right there. So we have here in Scripture, angel of the Lord, but angel is capitalized. What version are you reading from?
NKJV.
And it's capitalized? Yeah.
Yep.
So anytime that there is a capitalization of angel of the Lord, this is what we would call a theophany. So this is a pre-incarnate Jesus appearing to Moses in the burning bush. So bush is on fire. Would you go down to verse 5 and 6 and read those?
Exodus 3, verse 5. Then he said, "Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God.
Okay, so we have the holiness of God on display here. And then God says, don't come any closer, because his full-on presence cannot be near the sin of man. But out of respect, remove your sandals from your feet. And then, of course, Moses hides his face and he's afraid to look at God, as I would be as well. But then we see later on in the intimacy that Moses has with the Lord, Moses has his face shining so brightly from being in the presence of the Lord that when he comes back to everyone else, he has to again hide his face. This time not out of fear of the Lord, but this time because the presence of God was so close to him that he is now, for the sake of the Israelites, hiding his own face. Just incredible story. So with the burning bush, I've gotten the question sometimes of like, was it actually a bush on fire? Because it says it's not being consumed. And then you have some of these people who would say like, oh, well, maybe it wasn't actually fire. Maybe it was something like a lot of scientists are like, oh, it could have been a gaseous pod, like a gaseous seed pod that was releasing spores from the bush. But then you have to remember, Moses has been a shepherd in this wilderness for 40 years. If this was some sort of plant with gaseous pods, he would have seen this. He would have been aware. It wouldn't have been this thing that after 40 years he stops and goes, whoa, wait a second. So this bush is on fire, spiritual fire from the Lord. So in verse 8, the Lord says, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, from the power of the Egyptians, and bring them to a land that is good and spacious, a land flowing with milk and honey. So God explains to Moses, I have come to save them and fulfill the word that I gave to them, to bring them up out again from Egypt and bring them back to the promised land. And I've heard their cries. So now in verse 10, we get the mission of Moses. Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, and then bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And then in verse 11, we have this dialogue starting between God and Moses. So he says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring my people out of Egypt? And God says, certainly, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you. So Moses says, wait, I'm just a shepherd. I've been out here hiding for 40 years. How am I supposed to do this? What's interesting, though, is God has been preparing Moses for this specific task. Because think back to Moses growing up in the courts of Pharaoh. He is the only Hebrew who had the chance to actually see the courts of Pharaoh, how their political system works, all of this stuff. He is the only one that was able to walk into that place. And whenever he returns, it is because of that, because he was still known, that he was able to walk into the courts. No other Hebrew would have been able to do this. Then Moses said to God, behold, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, they will say, what is his name, and what shall I say to them? God says to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, you shall say this to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. So this is where we get the name of God. I am who I am. But when you look at the Hebrew, it is I am, I was, and I forever will be. Meaning I am all power. I have always existed. I always will exist. And I always keep my word. Then God said to Moses, this is what you shall say to the Israelites. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. So then he tells Moses, gather the elders of the tribes of Israel together and speak with them. You guys go back on your own and read through this. We're going to skip down to verse 19. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless he is forced by a strong hand. So I will reach out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go. And I will grant this people favor and respect in the sight of the Egyptians. Therefore, it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. So he is telling Moses, when you go, I know Pharaoh is going to be stubborn. Because you have to remember, the Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was basically a descendant of the sun god, that he was half man, half deity. So if that's your belief, and then some shepherd with a stick comes into your court and says, hey, God says to let these people go, you fully believing you are half God would be like, what? No, I'm not doing that. So Moses is aware that this has happened. God is aware, of course, that this is going to happen, but then God guarantees him, I'm going to show my power and he will let the people go. So then in chapter 4, would you read verses 1 and 2?
Okay. Exodus chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Then Moses answered and said, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord has not appeared to you. So the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a rod.
Yes. So at this point, we again have a question from Moses. Well, what if they don't believe me and take me seriously? And then he says, what's that in your hand? And then in verse 3, he asks him to throw it on the ground. Moses throws it on the ground. It becomes a serpent. It becomes the same serpent that is the royal symbol, which is on the crown of Pharaoh. And then he says, pick it up by the tail. So he picks it up, and then it becomes a staff in his hand again. And then God says in verse 5, you shall do this, so that all the elders may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has most certainly appeared to you. Cool magic trick. So God already gives him this one sign. Bro, I'm going to turn your stick into a snake if they don't believe you. And then he says that he doesn't give him just that. God says in verse 6, put your hand into your robe where it covers your chest. So Moses puts his hand in his robe, and when he takes it out, it's leprous and white as snow. So he puts his hand inside of his robe, pulls it out. Suddenly his hand looks sickly. God says, put it back in there, pull it back out. Hand is healed. So he's showing Moses all of these different things. And one thing also that I love about the snake is not only is it representative of the Pharaoh, but we also see Satan using a snake in the beginning to trick mankind. But what this miracle shows is it shows Moses that God could use anything, even the wickedness of Satan, to further his own purpose. So not only is God saying like, hey, you know the sign of Pharaoh, the snake? Yeah, boom. Look at that. Control over it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we have in verse 10, which I'd like you to read, 10, 11, and 12, we have another reply from Moses. After seeing all of these miracles happen, what does Moses say in verse 10?
Okay. Exodus chapter 4, verses 10. Then Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. So the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Should I keep reading?
Mm-hmm.
Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and teach you what you shall say. But he said, Oh my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send.
And stop there. So now, Moses begins with some legitimate questions. Like let's say the Lord tells you to do something. You have legitimate questions at first. okay, God, what do you want me to say
Yeah.
whenever I go and do this? Like, what are the words that you have to say? Who do I tell them is sending me? What if they don't believe me? Legitimate questions. Then God shows him the miracles. God turns a stick into a snake. He turns his hand leprous and then turns it back to how it is normally. Moses, after seeing God miraculously change the physical, then says, oh, but God, I don't talk so good. So now we're no longer at a point of questioning. We're at the point of Moses simply doesn't want to do it. And he's making excuses. Because if you just saw the Lord
All the miracles.
physically, change your hand, but then you say, oh, but I can't talk.
I think it might even be like a situation of self-doubt.
Yeah.
Like how you see yourself versus how God sees you. Because that's one of the notes I made, and how it's something that everyone struggles with. And like every time God approaches, like if we look at the Bible, whenever he would approach someone, like Gideon, for example, the angel of the Lord was like, mighty man of valor, something along this line. He's like, who, me?
Yeah.
I think genuinely, because we live in a fallen world, we don't have the ability to see ourselves the way God sees us.
Yeah.
And the only way we can see is when we encounter God or when we study the Bible. And even like when we would see miracles, because I'm sure this has happened to you before. Maybe you were praying to God, like, God, please just do this one thing for me. And God does it. And then you go back into that cycle of self-doubt. So I genuinely feel like he didn't have the ability to see himself the way God saw him, because this is someone who was raised in the palace. Like the children of royalty, they're always like top of their class. They have the best tutors, you know. And like every other person who described Moses in the Bible, they did not describe him as someone who was slow of speech, but that's how he saw himself. And it could even be a case of the 40 years in the wilderness had really like gotten to him, so he didn't see himself like even how he was in the palace. So I genuinely feel like at that point he's just like, I can't do this. Just even the severity of like what God was asking him to do, it was massive. Delivering, like Pharaoh was, I think at the time, the most powerful.
Egypt
ruler.
was a superpower at the time.
At the time, so it's like, me of all people, like I'm a shepherd in the wilderness. Like, what could I possibly tell Pharaoh that he would listen to me? So I think like it's a struggle for everyone. Like, and every single time God approaches people, like he's not gonna say like speak to you the way you see yourself. Of course not. That's not how he made you. I think that's why it's always a wrestle, like between how I see myself and how God sees me, and that's kind of what Moses was having to deal with.
I find it interesting God's reply, and this is what I think. This is what I think is kind of a parallel here to back in Genesis. Is Moses says, I am slow of speech and tongue, which you could take that as his excuse for why he can't do it. But the Lord's reply is what makes me think this is similar to Adam's reply to God. When why did you eat the fruit of the woman that you gave me? Almost as if Moses knows this is the God who created him. God, you created me with a stutter. God, you created me with like, whatever. Like I can't talk, and you did that, so I'm not your guy. You need to send somebody else. And then his reply is, I'm sorry, who made man's mouth? Did you not just see that I physically did these miracles? And then he tells him, now then, go, and I even will be with your mouth. And then again, we see Moses once more. Please, my Lord, send the message of the rescue of Israel by someone else, whomever else you will choose. So at this point, there could have been that self-doubt. But now at the bottom, I think Moses is just like, I just simply don't want to do this. I think he could have gotten, because I understand this bit. He's 80 years old. He's been shepherding for 40 years. in the wilderness. He's comfortable. God, it's been 40 years. I don't want to go back there. I don't want to do this task. Here's every single excuse for why I don't want to go and do it. And then in verse 14, it says, "Then the anger of the Lord was kindled and burned against Moses. He said, 'Is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he speaks fluently. Also, he's coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be overjoyed. You must speak to him the words that I put, or you must speak to him and put the words in his mouth. I, even I, will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you are to do. Moreover, he shall speak for you to the people. He will act as a mouthpiece for you, and you will be as God to him, telling him what I say to you. You shall take in your hand this staff, with which you shall perform the signs, the miracles, which prove that I sent you.'" So then Moses goes away and goes back to Jethro, explains the whole thing, and then he begins his journey back to Egypt. Interesting thing with Aaron. Of course, we were talking about this earlier, God has his plan, but God sees every decision you will make and you won't make. God sees the multiple ways that something could play out. I don't think, and this is just me personally, this is my opinion, I don't think Aaron was actually supposed to go with Moses. Because it says here, before, God says, "I will be with your mouth." I think this was a task just for Moses. But because of everything that Moses said, God is like, okay, you're choosing this route. Take Aaron. Aaron was both a benefit and a hindrance to Moses throughout the entirety of this journey. So not only does this show us how good God is to still work with us and through us, through all of our arguing and questioning, but then it also just points out God is going to accomplish what he is going to accomplish with you, without you, or by sending somebody else to help you. Even if the assignment was just for you, God is going to send somebody to help you. Within all of your doubt, within all of your not wanting to do it, he is still going to accomplish it with you. Even though, because in verse 14, "Then the anger of the Lord was kindled and burned against Moses." Even in God's anger, he didn't say, "Okay, Moses, forget you." It's like,
That's true.
"Okay, I'll send your brother, and I'll be with you, and I'll be with him." It's just so interesting, the goodness of God and how he chooses to still work with us, because we're all so stupid. We all are evil, and we are all stupid. Love everyone out there listening, but none of us are good. None of us are talented without the Lord. He is the only one that is good, and every bit of creativity that you have, every bit of talent that you have comes from him and comes from his goodness. He loves you, and he created you specifically the way that he did for his glory. And the best place that you can be at is realize that without God, I can't do any of this.
Yeah.
Or anything that I can accomplish in my own strength. What good is it? None of it is going to matter. So Moses goes. God says, "I'll send Aaron with you." Aaron is both good and bad in the situations. But now that is where we are going to stop with this section of the study, and then we will come back to the confrontation of Pharaoh in the next one. But before we go, we are going to ask a few questions, and the questions are also in the description in the video on YouTube, and they will also be in the description of the podcast wherever you are listening or watching this, so you can go and look there. So, first question: if you had been in Moses' position, How would you have responded to God's command to lead the Israelites out of Egypt? Iswat, would you want to answer this one?
Honestly, I feel like I would have taken the exact same response as Moses.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think I would have, just me personally, would have said, oh, you're going to rescue it. That's great. Let's go kill them. Like, let's just go wipe them out. God, I know you're powerful. Hit them with a fireball, and then I'll come in and get your people out. I would just be like, yeah, you go, you declare war on those people, you wipe them out, and then I'll come in and I'll help get the, maybe I'll, fight a couple of them here and there, get my fun licks in, and then we'll bring them out. But definitely not like hey, I want you to go and speak to people and we're going to wait. It's like, no, can you just go burn them all and then I'll help? But yeah, I would have taken the same approach of asking the questions of like, okay, what all does this entail? Like, what are you going to have me doing? What specifics am I agreeing to within this? Yeah. Number 2, what were Moses' fears and concerns? How did the Lord answer those issues?
So I think one of his major fears was, like, what would I tell the children of Israel? Who would I tell them sent me? I'm slow of speech. I can't do this. I can't do that. Yeah. And like for every single complaint that Moses had, God was able to show him, like, I am that I am. I'm the God of your father, Abraham, Isaac. For the stuttering, like God told him, like, I'm the one who makes mouth. I can sort out this whole slow of speech issue. What's the last one? Don't remember the last one.
What if they don't believe me?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then all the miracles that God said he can do.
I think that one would have been one of my major focuses. Is like, okay, God, I would love to go and tell these people what you said. Because I know that you said it. I'm hearing you right now. But what if they're refusing to believe? What if they don't believe what I'm saying? Which is an actual concern that the Lord answered through those miracles. Number 4. And then this one, you personally out there, read Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through 29 for context. What was Moses giving up by obeying God's command? And what did his obedience cost him? But what did he gain? So just from that, we won't read the Hebrews part, but what was Moses giving up to obey, but what did he gain?
I think he was giving up comfort.
Yeah.
Definitely, because when he went to Midian, he had a wife, he had kids, he was helping his father-in-law. So he was probably well taken care of. Like, those are the basic needs. Like, men of his time needed a wife, a job, kids.
Yeah.
So obeying God meant he would leave that comfortable lifestyle, that lifestyle of maybe not even applying a lot of faith, just like day-to-day routine. And then he's jumping into like an unknown and probably a more dangerous season.
Yeah. And
I think it's important to highlight that obedience to God would always cost you something, as we can see from Moses' life. But like what he gained was, I think, the most important thing that you had mentioned before was a relationship with God.
Yeah. Because
even at the end of his life, when he didn't make it into the promised land, he wasn't displeased. Like I think he got the better deal, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. This guy wrote the Pentateuch.
Exactly.
He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible and gave us all of this history. And one thing that I tell people about like intimacy with God, any sort of close intimacy has to have history. Like your relationship with someone has to have history in order for it to be deep. And so Moses gives us this history of God's character. So that whenever we actually go into this relationship with God through Jesus, we get to look back and see the history of who God is, see the history of his character and how he keeps his promises, all these different things, even the promise of Jesus and salvation. God would have used somebody else, but like Moses got to start this, basically.
Yeah.
And then the laws of God, everything that followed, just incredible.
Yeah.
Number 5, at what point did Moses' questions go from legitimate concerns to stubbornness? And how can we distinguish between those two responses in our own hearts? So for you, where do you think his transition from legitimate concerns into stubbornness came into play?
I think legitimate concerns were, who will I tell them sent me, or I'm slow of speech. Maybe he was slow of speech, or he had become slow of speech when he left Egypt. Those are legitimate concerns that I think anyone, like if God gives you an assignment, everyone has a question like, God, how?
Yeah.
How will I do this? I don't feel qualified. I've never done anything like this before. And God is able to meet you at that point and encourage you. Like with Gideon as well. He said, I'm the least of the least in my father's family.
Yeah.
However, he chose to believe what God said over him as opposed to his reality. And like God did incredible things through Gideon.
Yeah.
So from legitimate concerns to what? Complaints? Stubbornness was when God had clearly answered all of the questions he had, but he still kept insisting, God, send someone else. I don't want to go. I think at that point his heart must have become stubborn. And I think I understand, because like this is like he fled from Egypt.
Yeah.
Like he had no idea like what's going on. Will they kill me if I like I understand his concerns. However, God had already told him like, I will go with you. Yeah. So it's like there's no need to be concerned anymore. So I think at that point when he kept insisting that, I don't want to have anything to do with this mission, that's when he switched from legitimate to stubbornness.
Yeah. When I look at it, and of course everyone's going to see it at different points because we have different personalities, and seeing the different aspects of God through what he's telling Moses, right at the point where God tells Moses, listen, Pharaoh's going to be stubborn, but I'm going to like hit Egypt with all of my power. Not all of it, because I'll be destroyed, but I'm gonna flick Egypt with my power. At that point, I would have been like, okay, if you are going to bring the might of your power against a superpower of the world right now, I'm gonna be fine. And so I think for me at least, after that point, I think it was reaching into stubbornness after God literally just guarantees him like, hey, Pharaoh's going to be stubborn. The guy that thinks he's a god is going to be stubborn, but he's going to let them go because of what I'm going to do. After that point, I feel like he reached into some stubbornness. When has God called you to do something that was outside of your comfort zone, and how did you respond to that calling? That's a fun one. I can start us off.
I have a couple.
Pastoring. I did not want to do any of this. I don't enjoy lots of people. I figured this out about myself the other day, because I've always said I don't like people, or I've said like I hate people, but I've discovered I actually don't hate people. I hate what people do. I hate what people say. I hate what people think. Okay. But I love the idea of people from God's perspective. But then with being a pastor, now I have to listen to what people think. Now I have to listen to what people say. I have to be, quote, bothered by people, which is not within my interest, because I just don't want to do it. Like Moses, like, God, find somebody else. I don't want to do that. And then even similarly to Moses, I don't talk so well. Mine isn't, I don't talk so well. Mine is, I have nearly zero empathy for people. I'm not concerned with people's problems. Find somebody who's going to actually like care to listen to these people, God, because I don't. But then God, he puts it in you. He finds either something that he put within you deeply and brings it out and manifests it, or he just gives you what you need for it to happen. But I fought God for a while on pastoring and teaching, and now it's one of my favorite things. How about yourself?
I think for me, off the top of my head, would probably be pursuing a PhD degree. So I'm not the smartest person in my family. I was actually like the, what do you call them? The ugly duckling of the family. When it came to academics, I believed it wasn't my thing. I don't believe that anymore.
Yeah.
But out of my siblings, I was the one who always had like the poorest grades, and I would be the one who would hide her report card so that her parents wouldn't see her results because it was that bad. And so when I finished my master's degree and God like started nudging me to pursue a PhD degree, I'm like, I don't see how this is possible because I'm not that smart, God. At least I don't think I'm that smart. I have no idea what I'm going to do in this degree. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I've never had a desire to do this thing. But if you say do it, I would try and do it. And so I did. And honestly, like, I'm glad I did because it pushed me out of my comfort zone. It helped me grow beyond, my limitations. And like I was also able to discover like my passion and my love for teaching in that season. So it was good. It was good. It was tough, but it was good.
Yeah. And I think that's what's so great about his character is obviously he knows us better than we know ourselves.
Absolutely.
And we can become so comfortable in the day-to-day of what we're good at or what we perceive ourselves as good at when he's like, no, I know there's more to you than this. Let's get you out. Let's experience a little bit of discomfort so we can get you where you need to go.
Yeah.
And then last one, is the Lord presently calling you to some difficult act of obedience? And are you making excuses or are you moving forward? That's the one that we will leave you guys with because that's an interesting one. Yes, so that is it for Exodus 1 through 4, going over who Moses is, what God calls him to do. We'll see you on the next one when we go through the confrontation of Pharaoh. Goodbye, everybody.